This is a Stave snare drum, and building this is something I've wanted to do for a very long time. In fact, when I first started researching it, I was completely new to woodworking, and it was the idea of building this drum shell that kind of sparked an all-new interest in woodworking. So with that, I'm gonna start right here at the very beginning, and this video is gonna walk you through the entire process I went through. And of course, at the end, we're gonna hear how it all sounds. So first up is wood selection. I bought a variety of things, but in the end, I used hard maple and jatoba. And the jatoba is what inspired me to do the checkered pattern. I just thought it contrasted so nicely with the hard maple and would make for a really cool shell. Now, most modern drums that are 14 inches in diameter are actually not 14 inches. They're 13 7/8 of an inch. So I'm gonna make a 20 stave shell, or at least each layer is going to be 20 staves. So in order to do this properly, each strip needs to be exactly 2.24 inches wide at its widest point, and they also need to be the same thickness. So the first thing I did was take all the wood to the table saw, cut them into the long strips needed for the staves, and then I also cut them to the same width. This is something that you might normally do on a planer, but I was able to do it on the table saw, which is fortunate because I do not have a planer. So at this point, you might be wondering how I even calculated all of this, and I actually did not. I found an incredibly cool website that basically is a stave drum calculator. You just enter in a bit of information and it spits out exactly what you're going to need to do in order to make a shell. I have no idea who made this website, but it's incredibly cool, and I will put a link for it in the video description. Now at this point, I went to cut the staves, and as you see here, I'm actually doing all of the stave cutting on the miter saw. In the time since filming this is the one thing that I have changed. I am no longer doing the angle cuts here, I'm doing them in one long pass on the table saw. And I've built a few shells since, and this seemed to resolve all of the issues that I ran into. I think it's just that doing the angle cut on the table saw in one long pass ensures that the angle is going to be super precise throughout the whole thing. And then I take that over to the miter saw and cut it into individual depth pieces. Now I think the reason this is such a problem on the miter saw, unless you have a very high precision tool, is that you're actually moving the blade to the wood versus on a table saw, you're moving the wood to the blade. So the blade isn't really what's changing, it's just kind of being pushed through it. As soon as you start moving the blade, it kind of could shift even the slightest bit, and those slight angle changes are more likely to throw everything off. I mean, there are so many points of contact for a stave shell. If anything is even slightly off, that's when you end up with something like this. So as you can see, it just didn't adhere properly. I tried to do the glue up stubbornly. I knew it wasn't really fitting right, but I just put that ratchet strap on there anyway. And sure enough, there wasn't enough point of contact and the whole thing was very weak. And as soon as I started sanding, it all fell apart. So I was way too stubborn to start over at this point. And I decided to do a little bit of experimenting and just kind of start with that first strip that turned out really well, and then go from there individually. That's right, I glued up every piece individually from there on. And this took literally days, and I definitely do not recommend doing it this way. I also wasn't sure it would even work. I was worried that the structural integrity of the shell would not be sound. And in the end, it did work, but it just took way too long. But I guess it was a good experiment. At any rate, I got really frustrated throughout this process, and eventually I just stopped filming altogether. And when I finally did start filming again, this is what the shell looked like. So yeah, looking a whole lot better now. Took a long time to get it to this point, much longer than it should have, and in all honesty, I felt very compelled to start over entirely and not include any of this stuff in the video, none of these mistakes or any of the things I had problems with, but ultimately I decided that I should just include all of it. I mean, the reality is that this is the first stave shell that I made, and at the time I really was just trying to figure things out as I went along, so instead of making this super perfect video where it looks like I really know what I'm doing, I thought it would just be more fun to include everything, the good stuff, but also the mistakes. And maybe in time, if I do more videos like this, you'll see my woodworking skills improve. But for now, you guys are kind of learning alongside me, and that's kind of what makes it fun. So back to what's happening in the video, the next step was to sand the top and bottom and get the shell nice and level. As you can see, I'm also saving some of the sawdust in case I need to use it to fill any cracks at a later time. But once the drum shell was level on the top and bottom, I could sandwich it in between these rounds that allow me to turn it inside the jig. And in case you're wondering how the jig works, how I knew how to build it, and what it even is, I'm gonna cover all of that in another video that I'll be uploading shortly after this one. In fact, that video is actually done already. I just decided I wouldn't upload it first because I sent it to a friend of mine, kind of to just get some feedback, and he very politely said to me, "Dude, this is really cool, but I don't think a lot of people even know what a drum jig is. So why don't you make the first video about just building the drum itself and not focus so heavily on the jig?" And I kind of paused for a moment and realized, yeah, that makes way more sense. I sometimes forget that not everyone wants to go out and build something like this themselves, that they might just enjoy watching someone else build it for fun, and that's kind of why the internet rules. But I figured, this video is going to be a lot more entertaining, hopefully anyway, than the jig-specific build video. But in case you're a nerd like me and you want to see that too, don't worry, it's coming. But for now, I will stop talking for a moment, and we're going to actually see the jig in action and use it to round the outside and the inside of the shell. And with the outside of the shell done, I can now remove the rounds, put the shell directly on the bearings, thus opening up the entire center cavity, move the rails down below, and then run the router through the inside to round the inside of the shell as well. So right off the bat, I noticed some imperfections in the shell, just some stuff that I knew was going to need to be filled with some sawdust and wood glue or maybe some wood filler, but this was kind of to be expected given how I did the glue up. I knew there might be some little voids to fill, and considering that, actually, it turned out way better than I thought it was going to. I mean, really well, actually, and I was getting quite excited at this point in general just to kind of see it finally coming together and really looking like a snare drum shell. It was very satisfying, so yeah, definitely makes me want to build more snare drums, but one thing at a time. So off camera, I did end up using a little bit of sawdust and wood glue to fill some of the smaller voids that had been created, but I also thought it was going to be a much bigger issue than it was. It ended up being totally fine, so I put on a podcast that I like, got some noise-canceling headphones, and got started with the sanding. I ended up sanding to around 240 grit. I did also end up sanding again later on, right before I applied finisher, but for right now I kind of just got everything up a little bit closer to where it would be in the end. You may have also noticed what I was doing just now. I like to take a pencil and kind of use it to write all over a surface that I'm about to sand. It kind of just lets me see where I have and haven't already gone and kind of stay organized before I move up to the next grit. And with that done, it was time to move on to bearing edges. I didn't do anything particularly special for the bearing edge. I just went with a 45 degree on the inside and a round over on the outside. With that said, I did actually do quite a lot of research prior to making this decision. I read a lot about the bearing edge and also about snare beds, because both of those things seem to be incredibly subjective. It seems like one of those things that it really just depends on what you like, and some people like a much harsher bearing edge, some people like it to be a round over all the way on both sides, some people like a very wide and shallow snare bed, some people like it to be more narrow or deeper. It really is just what you're into, and you're not going to really know that until you try some different stuff out. So for this drum, I decided to just not overthink it too much and go with this. Plus, the 45-degree inside round over outside seems to be like a pretty common one to do. So that's what I went with, and maybe down the line, I'll try something else out. And the next step here is actually going to involve a piece of the hardware, so I'll just take a quick break and tell you a little bit about that. Pretty much everything that I'm using I got on AliExpress, except for the tension rods. I got those on Drum Factory Direct, as well as these black screws that connect the tube lugs to the shell. I didn't know that the shell was going to be as thick as it was, and the screws that came with the lugs weren't long enough. And the snare strainer is actually just old parts that I had laying around, part of a Tama strainer and a part of a trick strainer. And lastly, I went with some S-hoops, mostly because they were really affordable, but I've heard really good things about them too, and I've never used them, so I figured this would be a good time to try them out. So like I said, this next part actually utilizes some of the drum hardware. Very simple idea, but definitely not an original idea. I saw this online somewhere and I thought it was really clever. Basically, you take some screws that are the same diameter as the screws that attach the lugs to the shell. You cut off the heads and then grind those to a point. And what you're left with is something that lets you mark up the shell very precisely. You know, you don't have to measure the distance between the holes on the lugs. You're actually using the lug to mark those up. And it worked really well, very precise, and I just thought it was really quite clever. I can't remember where I got this mat, but I found it online somewhere many years back. I actually bought it way before I ever ended up using it. But it's a really handy tool. It lets you see exactly where you need to mark up a shell for drilling for anything that's 6, 8, or 10 lugs in a variety of sizes. And I used it to measure everything and mark it up before using my little lug contraption with the pointed ends. I also made sure to double check everything. I measured everything twice prior to doing any of this, just to be really sure that it was all correct. And once I was sure of that, I went back with the nail and very lightly hammered just to kind of get those indentations slightly more defined prior to taking everything over to the drill press. Speaking of, drilling is pretty self-explanatory, so I'm going to take another break from talking and we'll just do a little drill press montage. And with the drilling out of the way, we can now move on to snare beds. Before we get to that though, you may notice these strips that I've added to the shell right here. I added these off camera in another glue up that I did. I became increasingly concerned about the structural integrity of the shell, and when I was doing the test fit and tensioning on one of the heads, I heard a slight cracking noise. And it could have been anything. Frankly, it could have just been the drum heads kind of crackling as they do when you put a fresh set on. But I figured that if anything was going to crack on this shell, it would probably be right around where these strips are, because those were the last staves that I glued in during the glue up. and those last pieces were very difficult to get in there. So just to be safe, I figured I'd take a couple of the leftover pieces of Jatoba that I had, clamp them to the shell super tightly with some wood glue, and just kind of add that for structural support. I didn't have enough to do full reinforcement rings all the way around, so I know this looks a bit unconventional, but it definitely helped, or at the very least is a safer bet. I did do another test fit afterward, and I did not hear any crackling whatsoever, so hopefully we're all good no matter what. Back to the snare bed, I didn't do anything too special for this. There were some things online about building elaborate jigs to make this really precise, but the vast majority of people that kind of do DIY snare drums seem to just do it by hand, and that's exactly what I did. I measured a few snare beds on other drums that I had and tried to get them about the same. It's about 3 inches wide, and it kind of just contours down and back up, and I tried to make it as even as possible on both sides.
Take full custody of Cinnamon.
With that done, I just had to do a bit more drilling for both sides of the snare throw-off as well as the vent, then do a little bit more sanding up to a nice high grit, and then we could move on to finishing. Probably about a year ago, I did a video on my Instagram where I built this rack case right here in the background. And if you saw that, you might recall that I talked about how I used this Waterlock's original resin-modified tongue oil, and it was recommended to me by my friend David R on YouTube. And I actually asked him about what I could use to finish a drum with the intent of finishing this drum, and he suggested this stuff to me. I ended up not using it yet for the drum because I hadn't finished the drum yet, but I had finished that case. So I used it on the case first, and then it kind of has just sat there for the last 6 or 7 or 8 months. I don't even know how long anymore, until I finally finished this project. But the whole reason I had that stuff was to use for this project. I just got very delayed. My life changed a lot in the last 8 months. I had to move very unexpectedly, but I finally got it done. At any rate, back to the finishing. Let me tell you about what I'm doing. So I applied a very thick coat, and then I would sand using pretty high grit sandpaper, anywhere between 600 and 1000 grit. And after that, I would apply another thick coat. And I did this probably for, honestly, I lost track, but I think somewhere between 5 to 8 thick coats like that. And then once I did all of those thicker coats, I switched to doing very thin coats, and I used these little I think they're like makeup removers. They're just very, very soft. And I use those to apply very thin coats, and then I would very lightly sand. And then the last coat or two that I didn't sand at all. And honestly, I think it turned out incredibly. The finish really looks like a lacquer finish. I mean, I really took my time with it, but as you can see, I mean, it really looks incredible. So huge shout out to David for that recommendation. Definitely a product I will be using again on future snare drums. And real quick, before we play it, got to give a huge shout out to Evans, a brand that I've endorsed for many years now, and I've worked closely with. They've taken really good care of me, and they make amazing stuff. So for this drum, I'm going with a UV2, which is a 2-ply coated head with the UV coating on top, one of my favorite go-to heads. I do actually kind of prefer single-ply heads in terms of sound, but I learned a long time ago that single-ply heads do not last me very long. I hit too hard and I dent them very quickly. And then on the bottom, I go with a snare side 300. And then for snare wires, I'm using a Pure Sound 24-strand brass snare wire. And as for the demo that I'm about to play, all of the music in this video that I used in the background is stock Adobe stuff by a composer named Alexei Anisimov, I think is how you say his name. And I just thought it was really cool, so I just wrote some drums to one of his pieces, and then I recorded it 3 times with a high, medium, and low tuning for the snare. And then this performance piece kind of cuts between all of them. And with that being said, let's go ahead and finally check out how this thing sounds. Before I go, I just wanted to remind you all, in case you missed it, that I now have a signature stick with Meinl stick and brush. It's been out for a little while, and I really love it, and it seems like a lot of people love it because they keep running out of stock in most places, at least over here in the US. So Meinl has just mailed the rest of the stock that they have in the States to Sweetwater. So Sweetwater should have some in stock for all those that were asking. If you go to Sweetwater and they're not in stock, please check back because they are currently making more and sending them over from Germany. So they should have a lot more stock soon. And there are some other places online that have them in stock, but I think moving forward that Sweetwater will be the place that has the most stock. So definitely check there. And I hope you'll try it out because it's a great stick. Perfectly weighted, perfect size. I just really love it, and I love Meinl, so it's a great fit. And yeah, check that out. And I also hope you enjoyed this video. I know it's a little bit different than what I normally do, so let me know what you think, and I will see you next time. Peace.